Welcome to part 1 of Why I Like Star Trek, the motion picture. Just want to let you know that there is a prologue to this 3-part episode, and please check it out before watching this part of the review, if you haven't already. Okay? Okay. Let's begin. The film starts off with a nebula or cloud of some sort traveling through space, but then 3 Klingon ships approach the cloud. They don't know what this thing is or why it's traveling through Klingon space, and so, like with all good Klingons, they start shooting at it. But unfortunately for them, this cloud shoots back at them and completely annihilates them in minutes. Moments before the Klingons' demise, they contact a Federation communication station called Epsilon 9 and inform the crew of their attack. The crew then plots the course of the cloud, and to their dismay they discover that it is headed for Earth. During this time on another planet, our half-Vulcan, half-human, Spock, is meditating in an effort to purge all human emotion. Now, for those that don't know, not only are Vulcans a race of aliens that do not believe in emotions or feelings and only rely on pure logic to govern their actions, they also, at least to a certain degree, possess a form of psychic ability, or in other words, the ability to read thoughts. But during his meditation, Spock senses the presence of a great unknown intelligence. This continues to distract and trouble him, even during an acceptance ceremony of which the Vulcan priests then realize that Spock has not achieved the purging of emotion. Because of his feeling human half, the priests deny him acceptance and leave behind a disappointed Spock. Meanwhile, on Earth, at Starfleet headquarters in San Francisco, a shuttle lands at one of the stations, revealing our main character, Admiral James T. Kirk. Kirk bumps into Commander Sonak, a Vulcan science officer, and asks him why he isn't at his new post on board the newly refurbished and refitted USS Enterprise. Apparently, the new captain requested that Sonak continues final science briefings on Earth instead of working on preparing the vessel for an emergency launch. Very quickly, we see Kirk in a disagreement with those orders and promptly tells Sonak to report to him on board the Enterprise in 1 hour. Now, I want you all to take note that the second in command of the Enterprise is a Vulcan science officer. I will explain later why this is important. The film then cuts to a scene of a space station orbiting Earth, and on board we get to see Chief Engineer Montgomery Scott, or simply known as Scotty, overseeing Kirk's transportation on board the station. As soon as Kirk materializes, Scotty almost immediately complains to Kirk of why the untested, refitted Enterprise is forced to launch in less than 12 hours. But once the two are alone on a docking shuttle, Kirk very quickly tells Scotty of the alien cloud-like object headed straight for Earth, that it will arrive in less than 3 days, and that the Enterprise is the only ship within interception range of that alien object. Now, I have to admit, this is a bit strange. Why would the Enterprise be the only vessel in interception range? I mean, Earth is, after all, the headquarters for Starfleet, right? Who knows? Maybe the Enterprise was just one of many ships to be refitted, and that the Enterprise is much closer to completion than the rest. Also, maybe the rest of the fleet are probably in deep space with only the smaller ships left behind to patrol our solar system, or something like that. Does it really matter? Well, yes, I do think that something like this is very unlikely, and that it's just a cheap excuse to get the Enterprise to go on this adventure. But I don't think it is a big deal. I mean, other people don't think this plot convenience is a big deal in other Star Trek films like Wrath of Khan, so I'm not gonna make it a big deal in this movie. So during the flight to the space dock that houses the Enterprise, Scotty reflects on the bad situation that they are in. He goes on to explain that the warp engines haven't been tested yet, that the crew aren't all completely familiar with the ship's systems, and that the ship is under the command of an untried captain. But Scotty is then reassured by Admiral Kirk that the temporarily Captain Kirk will be in command of the Enterprise instead, that Starfleet has given the ship back to him. This amazingly perks up Scotty, and in that moment, Scotty reassures Kirk that he'll make sure that the ship launches on time. This gives us, the audience, an insight that Kirk was once the captain of the Enterprise prior to the refitting, but because of Scotty's reaction, it also gives us an insight as to what kind of captain he was, that he was a very capable and experienced one. We are then finally introduced to the USS Enterprise, and in this scene, we are treated to a swelling score by the movie's musical theme, composed by Jerry Goldsmith. This sequence is done really well as to have the walls of the space dock tease the audience of what exactly the Enterprise looks like, until we finally get the big reveal. Now, I know for those that have seen this movie are probably wondering what I have to say about the elephant in the room. but you're gonna have to wait a bit. I'll get to it later. We are then shown the bridge of the ship, and as to be expected, there's chaos everywhere. Everyone is stressed out and hard at work, desperately trying to get the ship ready for launch. Kirk arrives at this scene of chaos, but things quiet down very quickly as people take notice of the arrival of the new captain. They're all fully aware of his transfer in command, and they all seem to be very pleased to see him, solidifying the fact that Kirk is almost like a savior for the crew. Sulu, the helmsman of the ship, tells Kirk that Captain Decker is in engineering and that he doesn't yet know about the transfer of command. Kirk heads down to engineering, and we are then introduced to Decker. It's funny to note, as a contrast to the rest of the crew, Decker seems to be kind of calm and cheery in this scene. That doesn't last for long when Kirk gives him the bad news.
You personally are assuming command?
Yeah.
May I ask why?
My experience. 5 years out there dealing with unknowns like this. My familiarity with the Enterprise. It's cruel.
Admiral, this is an almost totally new Enterprise. You don't know her a tenth as well as I do.
That's why you're staying aboard. I'm sorry, Will.
No, Admiral. I don't think you're sorry. Not one damn bit. I remember when you recommended me for this command. You told me how envious you were and how much you hoped you'd find a way to get a Starship Command again. Well, sir, it looks like you found a way.
An interesting thing to note is that Decker doesn't passively accept this even in the presence of his superior. This gives us a hint that Decker is a bit of a hard hitter, much like Kirk himself. We then find out that Decker was recommended by Kirk to be the new captain to the Enterprise months earlier. Now, remember Commander Sonak, that Vulcan science officer I mentioned earlier? Most of us will only notice this when Spock shows up again later in the movie, but I thought I mentioned this now. Sonak and Decker are like younger versions of Spock and Kirk, as we, the audience, may have noticed, particularly during the space dock scene, and as pointed out by Decker, Kirk has a real soft spot for the Enterprise. So much so, in fact, that Kirk makes an effort to essentially find two commanders that possess similar traits to take control of the Enterprise, as if he cannot trust anyone else to do so. And it is here that we learn that Kirk almost regrets accepting promotion as a Starfleet Admiral, which probably explains why Kirk was so eager to take command at the first sign of an emergency. But unfortunately, shortly after this confrontation, one of the transporter consoles starts to malfunction and, well, let me show it to you.
Reesby, Starfleet! Override it! Pull them back!
Able to retrieve their pattern, Enterprise.
Give it to me.
Starfleet, boost your mat again. We need more signal. More signal!
They're losing their pattern.
Oh no, they're forming.
Starfleet, do you have them?
Enterprise. What we got back didn't live long, fortunately.
This is the stuff of nightmares. But this is exactly the sort of thing that would happen if this extremely complicated physics-bending piece of machinery fails. This definitely gives us the sense that building a vessel as complicated as an interstellar starship is something that can't be rushed. But unfortunately, given the circumstances, it is a risk that must be taken. A lot of people tend to think that this scene is a waste of time, but I do think it really does show us what is at stake here. Sadly, Commander Sonak was one of the casualties, and Kirk asks Decker if there is someone to replace him. And it's interesting to note that he prefers that someone to be a Vulcan, if possible. But there is no one else to replace Commander Sonak, and now Decker will have to double as science officer, since he is the next one to be most familiar with the systems. During the briefing of the ship's entire crew, the Enterprise receives a transmission from Epsilon 9 to update them on the alien object, but the alien object mistakes their scans as an attack, and in just a few seconds, Epsilon 9 vanishes. This information of how Epsilon 9 disappeared will actually be useful to the Enterprise later in the film. The Enterprise is finally ready to launch, and she awaits her final crew members to arrive. Among them, their new alien navigator, Lieutenant Ilea, and the ship's chief medical officer, as well as an old friend of Kirk, Dr. Leonard McCoy, also known as Bones. Right from this character's first introduction, we learn that Kirk and Bones are very close friends, and that we can assume that Kirk doesn't necessarily need him to be on the ship for just medical support, but maybe also for moral support. The ship is now ready to leave, and I must say, a great atmosphere is created here as the lights of the space dock fade out, and the Enterprise slowly comes alive as it lights up. We seem to live in a day where we are constantly being blazed with flashy visuals and with sound effects blasting in our faces, all in an effort to amaze and impress the audience. And yet, some of my most memorable film experiences can be as simple as a spaceship moving slowly out of space dock. Other people find this scene boring, but not only is this a realistic approach to spaceflight because the Enterprise can't switch over to its main propulsion until after clearing the space dock, but it is also reminiscent of a giant battleship or cruise liner moving out of its dry dock, with only little maneuvering engines to push the millions of tons out of the dock. For me, this scene gives the ship a sense of scale and weight. When Bones comes on board the bridge, Kirk then gives out the order to go to warp speed, but Decker, as well as Scotty, recommends that they run a few more tests to see if the engines will hold up, thus delaying the ship's contact with the alien object, which in Kirk's opinion does put the Earth at risk. So, for fear of the survival of Earth, Kirk instead does the more risky thing and orders them to go to warp immediately. Bones notices Kirk's impatience and then tells him to not be pushy, but Kirk doesn't change his mind. But disaster strikes as an engine imbalance causes a wormhole to appear. Sulu loses control of the controls and is unable to slow down the ship. And to make things worse, an asteroid is also caught up in the wormhole and will collide with the Enterprise. Eventually, the Enterprise will dissipate the wormhole, but not before the collision with the asteroid takes place. Kirk then gives the order to Mr. Chekhov to target the phasers at the colliding asteroid. Decker, however, cancels the order and tells Chekhov to use the torpedoes instead. They fire the torpedo and destroy the asteroid, and the wormhole vanishes. While Kirk sits in his chair, silent and with a bruised ego, the crew say a few relieving remarks and assess the state of the ship. Kirk then asks Scotty to get the engines back online as soon as possible, and then tells Decker to come with him to his quarters. Bones almost insists that he comes with them as if to act as damage control in this conflict. Some of the biggest complaints that are given to this film is that Kirk is being a bit of a jerk to Decker, that Kirk keeps messing with him by taking the Enterprise away from him, from temporarily demoting him to a lower rank, and by being all annoyed and bitter when Decker saves the day. Now, of course, I completely disagree with that observation, but you know what? Instead of me telling you all my own interpretation of this next scene, I'll show it to you and you decide what is actually happening here.
All right, explanation.
Why was my phaser order countermanded?
Sir, the Enterprise redesign increases phaser power by channeling it through the main engines. When they went into antimatter imbalance, the phasers were automatically cut off.
And you acted properly, of course.
Thank you, sir. I'm sorry if I embarrassed you.
You saved the ship.
When Decker explained to Kirk of why he countermanded his order, what did Kirk do? He agreed with him. In fact, he even went as far as to praise him for his quick thinking. But even after that, this happens.
You saved the ship.
I'm aware of that, sir.
Stop competing with me, Decker.
Permission to speak freely, sir?
Granted.
Sir, you haven't logged a single star hour in 2.5 years. That plus your unfamiliarity with the ship's redesign, in my opinion, sir, seriously jeopardizes this mission.
I trust you will nursemaid me through these difficulties, mister.
Even though Decker is right about how Kirk is at a disadvantage for being not as familiar with the Enterprise as he is, there is one thing that Decker fails to understand. What makes a good and reliable captain isn't just how well the captain understands the technicalities of a starship. If that were true, then Scotty would have become the captain. Just think about this for a minute. A gigantic, unstoppable, and destructive object is headed to Earth, and Starfleet should just send the inexperienced new guy? A lot of people fail to look at the big picture here of why Kirk was given command of the Enterprise. If Kirk didn't take control of the Enterprise, someone else would have instead. It's just that Kirk beat everyone else to it. Either way, Decker would not command this mission, but Decker doesn't understand this. I really have to hand it to Kirk here in the scene. After being embarrassed in front of his crew and being patronized by Decker, Kirk calmly asks Decker to nursemaid him through these difficulties. This is actually one of Decker's primary responsibilities on the ship as an executive officer, to advise the captain to support the captain, and yet Kirk has to keep reminding him of this. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that it had to be Kirk. Starfleet could have sent any other experienced captain, but the reason why the ship ended up with Kirk was because he insisted that it be him to command the Enterprise, and Bones may have figured out why.
Make your point, Doctor.
The point, Captain, is that it's you who's competing. You ram getting this command down Starfleet's throat. You've used this emergency to get the Enterprise back.
And I intend to keep her? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. It's an obsession. An obsession that can blind you to far more immediate and critical responsibilities.
At this point, Kirk has gotten used to brushing off criticism from Decker. But now it was coming from a trusted friend. This causes Kirk to wonder himself if he's even really doing this for the right reasons.